Chapter 11 of Pellucidar. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ralph Snelson. Pellucidar by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 11. Escape. Diane glanced downward and shuddered. Her tribe were hill people. They were not accustomed to swimming other than in quiet rivers and placid lakelets. It was not the steep that appalled her. It was the ocean, vast, mysterious, terrible. To dive into it from this great height was beyond her. I couldn't wonder, either. To have attempted it myself seemed too preposterous even for thought. Only one consideration could have prompted me to leap head foremost from that giddy height: suicide. Or at least so I thought at the moment. "Quick!" I urged Diane. "You cannot dive, but I can hold them until you reach safety." "And you," she asked once more, "can you dive when they come too close? Otherwise you could not escape if you waited here until I reached the bottom." I saw that she would not leave me unless she thought that I could make that frightful dive as we had seen Juag make it. I glanced once downward. Then with a mental shrug I assured her that I would dive the moment that she reached the boat. Satisfied, she began the descent, carefully yet swiftly. I watched her for a moment, my heart in my mouth lest some slight misstep or the slipping of a finger hold should pitch her to a frightful death upon the rocks below. Then I turned toward the advancing Hoosiers, Perry dubbed them, even going so far as to christen this island where Hooja held sway Indiana. It is so marked now upon our maps. They were coming on at a great rate. I raised my revolver, took deliberate aim at the foremost warrior, and pulled the trigger. With the bark of the gun the fellow lunged forward. His head doubled beneath him. He rolled over and over 2 or 3 times before he came to a stop, to lie very quietly in the thick grass among the brilliant wild flowers. Those behind him halted. One of them hurled a javelin toward me, but it fell short. They were just beyond javelin range. There were 2 armed with bows and arrows. These I kept my eyes on. All of them appeared awestruck and frightened by the sound and effect of the firearm. They kept looking from the corpse to me and jabbering among themselves. I took advantage of the lull in hostilities to throw a quick glance over the edge toward Diane. She was halfway down the cliff and progressing finely. Then I turned back toward the enemy. One of the bowmen was fitting an arrow to his bow. I raised my hand. "Stop!" I cried. "Whoever shoots at me or advances toward me I shall kill as I killed him." I pointed at the dead man. The fellow lowered his bow. Again there was animated discussion. I could see that those who were not armed with bows were urging something upon the 2 who were. At last the majority appeared to prevail, for simultaneously the 2 archers raised their weapons. At the same instant I fired at one of them, dropping him in his tracks. The other, however, launched his missile, but the report of my gun had given him such a start that the arrow flew wild above my head. A second after, and he too was sprawled upon the sward, with a round hole between his eyes. It had been a rather good shot. I glanced over the edge again. Diane was almost at the bottom. I could see Juag standing just beneath her, with his hands upstretched to assist her. A sullen roar from the warriors recalled my attention toward them. They stood shaking their fists at me and yelling insults. From the direction of the village I saw a single warrior coming to join them. He was a huge fellow, and when he strode among them I could tell by his bearing and their deference toward him that he was a chieftain. He listened to all they had to tell of the happenings of the last few minutes. Then with a command and a roar he started for me with the whole pack at his heels. All they had needed had arrived, namely a brave leader. I had 2 unfired cartridges in the chambers of my gun. I let the big warrior have one of them, thinking that his death would stop them all. But I guess they were worked up to such a frenzy of rage by this time that nothing would have stopped them. At any rate, they only yelled the louder as he fell, and increased their speed toward me. I dropped another with my remaining cartridge. Then they were upon me, or almost. I thought of my promise to Diane. The awful abyss was behind me, a big devil with a huge bludgeon in front of me. I grasped my 6-shooter by the barrel and hurled it squarely in his face with all my strength. Then, without waiting to learn the effect of my throw, I wheeled, ran the few steps to the edge, and leaped as far out over that frightful chasm as I could. I know something of diving, and all that I know I put into that dive, which I was positive would be my last. For a couple of hundred feet I fell in horizontal position. The momentum I gained was terrific. I could feel the air almost as a solid body, so swiftly I hurtled through it. Then my position gradually changed to the vertical, and with hands outstretched I slipped through the air, cleaving it like a flying arrow. Just before I struck the water, a perfect shower of javelins fell all about. My enemies had rushed to the brink and hurled their weapons after me. By a miracle I was untouched. In the final instant I saw that I had cleared the rocks and was going to strike the water fairly. Then I was in and plumbing the depths. I suppose I didn't really go very far down, but it seemed to me that I should never stop. When at last I dared curve my hands upward and avert my progress toward the surface, I thought that I should explode for air before I ever saw the sun again except through a swirl of water. But at last my head popped above the waves, and I filled my lungs with air. Before me was the boat from which Joag and Diane were clambering. I couldn't understand why they were deserting it now, when we were about to set out for the mainland in it. But when I reached its side, I understood. Two heavy javelins, missing Diane and Joag by but a hair's breadth, had sunk deep into the bottom of the dugout in a straight line with the grain of the wood, and split her almost in two from stem to stern. She was useless. Joag was leaning over a nearby rock, his hand outstretched to aid me in clambering to his side. Nor did I lose any time in availing myself of his proffered assistance. An occasional javelin was still dropping perilously close to us, so we hastened to draw as close as possible to the cliffside, where we were comparatively safe from the missiles. Here we held a brief conference, in which it was decided that our only hope now lay in making for the opposite end of the island as quickly as we could, and utilizing the boat that I had hidden there to continue our journey to the mainland. Gathering up 3 of the least damaged javelins that had fallen about us, we set out upon our journey, keeping well toward the south side of the island, which Joag said was less frequented by the Houyhnhnms than the central portion where the river ran. I think that this ruse must have thrown our pursuers off our track, since we saw nothing of them nor heard any sound of pursuit during the greater portion of our march the length of the island. But the way Joag had chosen was rough and roundabout, so that we consumed 1 or 2 more marches in covering the distance than if we had followed the river. This it was which proved our undoing. Those who sought us must have sent a party up the river immediately after we escaped, for when we came at last onto the river trail not far from our destination, there can be no doubt but that we were seen by Houyhnhnms who were just ahead of us on the stream. The result was that as we were passing through a clump of bush a score of warriors leaped out upon us, and before we could scarce strike a blow in defense, had disarmed and bound us. For a time thereafter I seemed to be entirely bereft of hope. I could see no ray of promise in the future, only immediate death for Joag and me, which didn't concern me much in the face of what lay in store for Diane. Poor child, what an awful life she had led! From the moment that I had first seen her chained in the slave caravan of the Mahars until now, a prisoner of a no less cruel creature, I could recall but a few brief intervals of peace and quiet in her tempestuous existence. Before I had known her, Jubal, the ugly one, had pursued her across a savage world to make her his mate. She had eluded him and finally had slain him, but terror and privations and exposure to fierce beasts had haunted her footsteps during all her lonely flight from him. And when I had returned to the outer world, the old trials had recommenced with Hooja in Jubal's role. I could almost have wished for death to vouchsafe her that peace which fate seemed to deny her in this life. I spoke to her on the subject, suggesting that we expire together. "Do not fear, David," she replied. "I shall end my life before ever Hooja can harm me. But first I shall see that Hooja dies." She drew from her breast a little leathern thong, to the end of which was fastened a tiny pouch. "What have you there?" I asked. "Do you recall that time